Welcome back to Beyond the Walls podcast. I am so excited. I know I say this every week, but I am just so excited. I love the conversations that I get to have here on the podcast. I love just being able to help expand the things that you're learning and you're going through to go beyond your walls. I know I'm with you. I am going through my own walls. I'm trying to go beyond every day. I'm living the stuff that I'm talking about, even on the good days and the bad days. So today, what I'm so excited about is a great friend of mine, Karen Louie, has joined us so graciously. She is across the country. We're in different time zones. I'm super early in the morning. She's super late at night. But it's just going to be such a valuable conversation that she has helped me with personally in my life. And I'm so grateful to be able to share it with you. So, Karen, I'm going to let you have so many accomplishments and have done so many cool things. I'm going to let you kind of introduce yourself and then we'll get into the topic of today. So, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be with you. We have been kind of talking about doing this for a while. So it's fun to
No.
actually get to make it happen. Thanks for inviting me. For the purposes, I suppose, of this time with you, um, I started kind of getting retrained right around the time I think I turned about 40. I'm
Mm,
62 now. So, but I went, we went back to school, my husband and I, and other people that we had on staff in our C region. But we took professional training courses in parenting. We got the equivalent of a bachelor's degree in counseling. And sometimes there's the old saying, the more you know, the more you don't know. So that
mhm.
just made us all hungry to learn more. And I ended up getting a master's in counseling and then becoming a solution focused therapist, also learning schema therapy, and eventually becoming a solution focused coach as well and a Clifton Strengths coach. And
Wow.
along the way, with my husband, we made up a marriage workshop and then wrote a book about that and a parenting workshop and wrote a few books about that, did some research. So, yeah, I've been doing this for a while and it's
Yeah.
pretty much my favorite thing to do. By the way, I would always say, the probably part of the reason uh, I've been able to do this effectively is also because I think I've made a lot of the mistakes that you can
Mm,
make. And so sometimes it's out of, it's learning through the school of hard knocks as well as all
yeah.
the certifications. So
Yes. Wow. And having all of those accomplishments together, like it's so inspiring to me. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that you kind of started really digging in your not until your 40s, right? I mean, I'm sure you've always been a learner. You went to college, you did lots of education and lots of smart things before, but just that reminder that we're always learning and we're always growing and to
absolutely.
keep shining, right? Like, cause I'm going to be 41 in a couple of weeks. And so it's just cool to be able to feel like there's no arrival and it's never too late. So thank you for
Absolutely.
reminding us of that. And so, yeah, one of the things I think because of that, for those of you listening, a few weeks back, I recorded an episode with my mom. And we talked a lot about just how to have those getting curious, get some comprehension, some humanity on our parents. So let me preface that, y'all. I forgot to tell you, we're talking about parent child relationships. And part of our own personal healing is being able to separate out, kind of what was given to us, that nurture and nature. What's my responsibility? What was my experience? And a lot of the healing that I have found is when we can just figure out how to separate. My parents are not my identity. And so, where do I get my identity from? And if it's not from my parents, it's not from the world, it's not from my husband, like all of these other humans that are just struggling in life is not where our identity comes from. Then who gives our identity, which isn't really the point of our conversation today. So come get coaching with me. Come find out if you really want to know where your identity comes from. Okay. And so, but we have to work with these people, right? They trigger us. They challenge us. They help us grow. They help us to feel loved and nurtured, right? Like their acceptance, their connection with us, like they're invaluable. We were not meant to be alone. And so how do we work with these people? When they love us, they make us feel good, they hurt us, they make us feel frustrated, right? So today, what I really want to help us to kind of dig into is if you are struggling, if you've never done it before, or if you've tried and it hasn't gone well, how do we repair, nurture, engage with our parents, right? We're all adults now. You probably are a parent yourself, and now you're trying to figure out, how do I do it differently, or what do I want to repeat? But let's dig in, Karen, and I would love to just kind of hear from your, like, all of the psychology and the counseling and the schema therapies that you've gotten. I would love to kind of have a meatier psychology kind of conversation about, like, what are some schemas or things that we might be in our way preventing us, or what we have to work with when it comes to trying to figure out who our parents are and who we are in relation to them. So what would be, let me rephrase that question, of what would be some common schemas that are preventing our healing between me as an adult and my parents?
Awesome. Great question. So, and there's so much that can be said about that. Just in case people would like to know more about schemas, let me introduce that concept of schemas.
Yeah.
So I think CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is one of the most commonly practiced therapies in the world. And the guy who invented that, Aaron Beck, his top student many moons ago, maybe, I don't know, 50 years ago, maybe, I believe at the University of Pennsylvania, was Jeffrey Young, who went on to establish the cognitive behavioral therapy, what do they call it, clinic in Manhattan. And from there, he felt the need to go deeper than cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's where he came up with this concept of schema therapy. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a great therapy and very effective. And it's about changing the way you think, changing your negative thoughts. In a nutshell, it's more than that.
Yeah.
But then the schema therapy says, well, what are the belief systems that are causing those thoughts in the first place? So the schemas are the patterns of thought that cause you to have the negative thought or whatever. So, for instance, someone might say, I have a phobia about spiders, and I can go for cognitive behavioral therapy and change that, get over that fear. But then maybe a schema therapist would say, well, let me do schema therapy with you and find out how you got the original fears, where those fears came from, and we'll be able to change you from that belief. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what schemas are about. And so there have been 18 negative schemas that were identified from research and through many years of practice by the therapists. And I would say one of the most common ones that causes problems between adult children and their parents is the negative schema of unrelenting standards. So a lot of older parents might be talking to their adult children without realizing it, speaking in such a way that it is, speaking out of their unrelenting standard schema. And they won't even know, they won't even have any awareness that they're doing that. And the way it comes across to the adult child is, wow, I will never be good enough. And
Mm,
so perhaps it's in the area of achievement, like at work, or perhaps it's who they chose as a spouse or what their marriage looks like. It might come out as how are you parenting? It
yeah.
can come out in so many different ways. It could come out even like when you're younger, it comes out maybe it's schoolwork or sports, or, it's sometimes even when you're a 40-year-old kid, you feel like your parent doesn't like the way you look. And, and you're
Mm,
feeling like I'll never be, beautiful enough for you. So it's just this
yeah.
concept of I'll never meet your standard. And
Mm,
it can even come out in Christian stuff, church stuff. Like
yeah.
they're not even happy with me, because my quiet time wasn't long enough, or who knows. So,
Yeah.
and then in schema therapy, we talk about having different coping styles. So if the adult child has the surrendered coping style, and they have been hearing that punitive parent voice, so to speak, from their parent for their whole life, they might just have that surrendered coping style and say, oh, well, I guess I will never be good enough anyway. Or
Mm,
if they have the avoidant coping style, they 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 don't want to think about it. They might get into addiction or harmful
mm,
habits, just as an avoider. You
yeah.
know. Or if they have the what they might call counterattacking coping style or overcompensating, they might just get angry and then try to prove that that's not true by doing, going the different direction. So that's just one
Yeah.
example. There's 18 schemas, and that's just one example.
Yeah.
Um, I do
Yeah.
have other examples if you have time, but do you want to
Yeah.
hear a few more schemas?
Ooh. Yeah, but I do really like that one. I'm glad you brought it up because I feel like that's probably it might be the one without us, like for us that just don't even have like the schema language. So thank you also for explaining the schemas. And something to keep digging into and understanding. But this concept, because I feel like that was probably the experience that I had. I share about how like my experience observing four generations with me, with my mom, with her mom, and her mom's mom.
Wow.
And the older two, right? Of just that feeling like nothing I do is good enough for you. And so I think, let me ask one more question about that one, and then we can get into another schema if we have time. The thing that I thought about in that, where if a child, an adult child, is experiencing that with their parent and that's their feeling, what is like a tool or something like what's the first step, I guess, in being able to just start like, okay, nothing's ever good enough. What's the very next step? Is it your own personal work? Is it understanding them? Is it, I guess, and maybe it depends on their coping style of will they go attack their parents and tell them they're being so, unrealistic with me? Like, what would be just like the very first start of the thought process for an adult if they're hearing that and they're like, oh, yeah, that's me. That's my parents.
Right. Great question. Let's see. I don't know that there's a correct first step for everybody because there might be a different first step for different people. So, and also it depends on what your relationship in general is like and how well you communicate with your parents. So if you have a pretty
Yeah.
decent relationship on the one hand, even though you're feeling frustrated on the other hand, um, you could approach it like they, probably don't know how they're making you feel, and you are if you're assuming the best, then you're assuming that if you can figure out how to say it to them in a vulnerable way, not accusing, but in a vulnerable
Yeah.
way that helps them to see their fault without feeling accused and judged.
Mm,
But what you're showing is I want to be close to you, but this is blocking me from being close to you because I feel judged and put down by you when I talk to you.
yeah.
I'm not saying those are the exact words, but something like that. That's if your communication with them is good.
Yeah.
And then you can see where that takes you. If your communication with them is not that great, you might first do some own work on yourself and kind of get the confidence, through being coached or whatever,
Yeah.
and through your own reading and whatnot, so that that what they're saying to you is not actually true. It's very hard to shake that off.
Yeah.
That's why we always say dysfunction is the gift that keeps on giving,
Mm.
because those schemas pass down, and
Yeah.
we end up having the exact same schema that's driving us nuts. So we have to be
Yeah.
careful with that. But yeah, doing some work on yourself, doing some journaling, that always helps. And
Yeah.
I found with my dad, he wasn't the best at listening when there was a difficult conversation, but
Mm.
I would write him letters. So
Mm.
I would often write handwritten letters to him over the years, and some of them I would just make them completely uh, encouraging. So so that
Yeah.
every time he got a letter from me, he wasn't dreading it. But then
Yeah.
every once in a while, I'd slip in one that had some things about, if you would change this, it would actually help. But
Mm.
you know,
Yeah.
that's but,
I love that. Those are great tips. And great suggestions, because I think that's where I want to just go get overwhelmed then and make it these all or nothing, like, and right or wrong. So even as you were thinking, I'll tell you what my first thoughts were, and you can tell me if there's a better or a different way. But um, I feel like sort of in my journey, when I started kind of just taking personal responsibility for who I am and realizing like my world is not in other people's hands, I think just even that being a first step to realize like, oh, maybe this has something to do with them and it's not all about me, right?
absolutely.
Like they're
Mm,
not the end all authority. They're not perfect. They don't have, and I appreciate what you brought up too. Like if you do have a sort of good relationship, like we could assume the best that like they don't even know that they're doing it. They have their own reasons why they're doing it. Like somebody handed something down to them and they're doing their best. Like they're trying to be loving, it's just missing the mark. And how do we just create something new? Like how do we communicate on the same page? Or it could be completely true and they're horrible. They have completely unrealistic expectations. They're not going to be pleasable. So how do we start like, okay, then my goal in life is not to please you, right? Like, so those are kind of like my immediate first thoughts.
all good. Love it.
All
Love it.
good.
Yes.
Perfect.
And in schema therapy, they will refer to different voices or modes, and they'll talk about the punitive parent voice. So
Mm,
if a parent is talking that way, is showing that they have the unrelenting standard schema when they speak to their adult child, it's very likely they themselves had a punitive parent voice from their own parent. Again,
yeah.
the dysfunction gets passed down. So
Yeah.
you're totally right. It's usually not about you. It's about what's going on in their head.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that was the whole point of the conversation I had with my mom,
Mm,
was like just to show that, right? Like here's just a possibility that you could believe. Like if we can get curious about our parents as human beings, like
yeah.
they're right, like they have the same upsets, the same frustrations, and oftentimes if you weren't close growing up, then you don't even know these stories about your parents, right? Like how
Right
curious
there.
have you gotten about how your parents were raised and what experiences they went through, and
Mm,
like the stresses, like okay, you're 40 now. What was your mom going through when she was 40? What was
mhm.
her marriage like? How old were you? What was her professional experience, right? Like, what was stressful in life
Yeah,
when she scarred you in that way, right? So
totally.
I love that. Okay, give us a few other schemas. Yeah, let's hear some more.
Okay, so another one I thought of was self-sacrifice. So
Mm,
self-sacrifice is an interesting schema because, especially for people that are brought up going to church and raised from that background, they're taught that they're supposed to sacrifice because, Jesus wants us to sacrifice. So then people will say, well, then how can self-sacrifice be a schema, a harmful, negative schema?
Mm.
So the issue is, yes, we are supposed to sacrifice if we happen to, to be a Christian. That is part of how we are more like Jesus. But the
Yeah.
self-sacrifice negative schema causes harm, whereas
Mm.
sacrificing as a Christian is going to bring you joy and, you know, cause good things to happen. But
Yeah.
when a person is ruled and fueled by the self-sacrifice negative schema, it's going to be causing harm to their health, harm to their families, so much harm. So that's how
Yeah.
you know it's a schema. So let's say if
Mm.
you're an adult child whose parent maybe, so as an adult child, let's say you're, 20, 30, 40 years old, and your parent is 40, 50, 60 years old, and they have the self-sacrifice schema. They might, you might be feeling that they're putting you on a guilt trip because
Mm.
they're constantly wanting you to have that same quote unquote standard of service and sacrifice that they have.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I've
Mm.
noticed, I think, as a pattern, it seems like people in the generation that we might call the millennials or Gen Z, those two generations, I
Yeah.
feel like they have seen their parents' generations, you know, like totally get burnt out at work, for example.
Mm.
And they're like, I'm not going to do that. Why should I do that?
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, like if you die at work from overwork, what will they do? Two or three people might attend your funeral and then they'll just hire someone else. Like,
Yeah.
why am I
Yeah.
killing myself for these people? But
Yes.
the older generations, people that are in their, especially in their 50s and 60s, uh, we were brought up thinking that was the right way to work. And you literally, kill yourself and I'll sleep when I die. I mean, I've heard people
Yeah.
say that. And um, so I think that self-sacrifice schema was very much built into those older generations. And of
Yeah.
course, there's a side of that that's beautiful, that you love serving people. Um, but again, it causes harm. And so if an older parent has that, the adult child might get fed up at being made to feel, this guilt trip kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so they would have to be able to say clearly, okay, mom or dad, I'm glad you love doing that, and that's great if that, is bringing you happiness, but you can't say that that's what everyone has to do to get happy or have
Yeah.
fulfillment or something like that. And you have to learn how to
Yeah.
bring things up like
Yeah.
that. And that can also be related to the schema of enmeshment, which you alluded to
Okay.
earlier when you were talking about learning to have autonomy and be yourself and
Mm.
figure out your identity. Um, Enmeshment is a schema that's more common among moms than dads, although I don't think it's completely absent among dads, but it's definitely more
Yeah.
common among moms, where they almost want the child, to be the same as them in every way. And
Mm.
the kid might grow up at first feeling like, oh, I'm so close to my parents. I love my mom. We're so close. But eventually they'll feel like, wow, I don't know where she stops and I begin. And I'm not
Yeah.
allowed to have my own thoughts. I'm not allowed to have my own desires and what.
Yeah.
And that's very obviously unhealthy. So,
Yeah.
but the self-sacrifice can sort of lead into that enmeshment
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. What do you feel like would be can you give us some practical examples of what the self-sacrificing looks like? Because I almost felt like in the word that I was thinking about was maybe is an adult child tempted to feel like their parents are always manipulating them? And that guilt trip, like, do they have to put on a guilt trip to get you to come to holiday dinners? Like how does that kind of show up in an everyday life in that
Good,
dynamic?
Good question. So, and so it's that question that you asked is sort of like showing the link between self-sacrifice and enmeshment,
Okay.
because if the parent might feel like their schedule is so important, I've planned this big family vacation, I've planned this big family dinner, and if you don't come, what does that say about our relationship, or something like that?
Mm,
Where so it's the parent feeling, I've sacrificed so much for you, why can't you sacrifice for me? That
yeah.
there's a lot of that language that goes on in some
Yeah.
families. I'm very blessed that that doesn't go out of my parents. I did not have that growing up, thank goodness. But I have seen that a lot.
Mm,
And I've seen it even in married couples. I remember there was a couple that I was helping. Both of them had the self sacrifice schema, and
mm,
both of them were trying to overcome it. But the wife was doing better than the husband. And she said no to something. And the husband was like, "Oh, come on. Can't you come and do that with me?" And she was like, "I thought you were going to be proud of me for overcoming my self sacrifice scheme."
yeah.
And so I was like, touche. I was like, that was a good one. But but I think parents get so used to sacrificing that then they don't see that their sacrificing can become harmful. So
Yeah.
I really, when I took the very first time I took the schema assessment for the negative schemas, this was one of my top three strongest schemas:
Mm,
self-sacrifice. And
mm,
when I talk about causing harm, see, a person who has self-sacrifice loves sacrificing. It's not
mm,
that they don't like it; they love it. They get all the
yeah.
good feels from it. But like I say, it causes harm. So what happened to me was I ended up getting psoriasis, a skin condition, which probably was in my body anyway. But
Mm,
all the stress I was putting on myself, you know, this was 20 years ago. This is not recent, but like 20 years ago, 2003.
yeah.
All that stress came out in a, somatic way because it shows up
Yeah.
physically.
Yeah.
And I ended up getting this skin condition. And I was like, I'm a happy person. Why is that happening? But then I
Mm,
realized I had just started learning to get in touch with my emotions. So I
mm,
at least was just learning, so that's good. But I realized I was just putting others first to the extreme. And
mm,
I would say it took me a good 10 years to work on it. It's not like I got
yeah.
an A+ the first year. But I would say I started working on it, you know. So it
Yeah.
took me at least 10 years.
Yeah. So I imagine what I'm hearing is that that's probably somebody who has a hard time setting boundaries, like our
Yeah.
boundary, because I think that's a common thing that we all talk about would be, I
Mhm.
need to have healthy boundaries, right? So that would probably be a good flag that it's probably something in that, the self-sacrificing
Yeah, yeah. And
schema.
and and again, it's you love doing it. It's not like
Yeah.
someone's, pulling your teeth to make you do it. You love doing it. That's the problem.
Yeah.
So then it's like, okay, I got to realize just because I love doing it doesn't mean it's good for me.
Yeah. Do you
Just like,
feel like in a relationship is part of those areas, is it the pressure from like the expectations of what you get in return? Is that where it kind of gets harmful? Like, so as a grown adult and your parent, if your parent has this, or if I don't do it, then it means I don't love you enough if I'm not willing to sacrifice to the same level return. Is that kind of where it gets
that's what,
harmful, is when you
yeah,
expect others to give back the same way that you gave to them?
that is one of the ways it can be harmful. Totally.
Yeah.
And it can also be harmful. For example, when my daughter was at university, and she went to school in the UK. I was living in Singapore, so we were many miles from each other. not like
Yeah.
just going to college down the street. So
Mm-hmm.
we, luckily, by the time she was at school, there was such things as, internet phone calls and whatnot. So we could have inexpensive phone calls. Otherwise, our phone bill would have been terrible. But
Yeah.
we were very close. We are still very close. She's 32 now. But at that time, she would sometimes go through things where, in her, she was in a campus group at church, a campus ministry group. And there were people in there that were also trying to make her be self sacrificing. And because I'd
Mm.
already had my aha moment and understood that, instead of me passing down my self sacrifice schema to her, I was able to say, all right, sweetheart, let's talk about what you really need to help you be your best. And
Yeah.
you're doing a great job being like Jesus. You're loving people. You have wonderful times with God. And I was able to talk her through all the things she was doing well. And then
Yeah.
it was one day she called me and there was some kind of a campus devotional on the Wednesday night and she was feeling the pressure to go. And I said, right now, I can tell from talking to you what's going to help you as a person is you need to take a nap because you haven't had enough
Mm.
sleep. And you need a good sleep, and then you need to get up and have a healthy dinner, not junk food, and do some reading and study for your test tomorrow. Have a good
Mm.
night's sleep tonight. Every God is happy with you. Don't worry about what other people are saying.
Mm.
And so I was able to coach her on not being self-sacrificing, if
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I hear in that of like she's not trying to go to that devotional out of avoidance or pressure. You're right. Like
Mm,
there doesn't need to be any morality about it. Like I'm pleasing God, I'm not pleasing God. There's pressure, right? The pressure to perform.
mm,
And how do we keep separating out why we're doing something? Is it just to earn their love, just to earn their approval? Or is it out of the overflow of our own just security and confidence and strength? Would that be an accurate depiction, I guess, of a healthy approach of how we're trying to separate these two things from a negative schema to a positive, healthy
yeah, because
place?
you ideally want your relationship with your parent to be healthy, to have a close connection.
Yeah.
And so if you have to do something or else, they're not going to be happy, then that
Yeah.
shows there's a weakness there. Now, I would also say, as wonderful as any parents can be, there will always be, I mean, we're all humans who have our
Yeah.
own foibles and shortcomings and our own biases and our own points of view. So
Yeah.
there'll never be perfection.
Yeah.
Um, but what's great is if you can open conversation, which if is
Yeah.
is if you can have good conversations. And you used a word at the beginning where you talked about being curious.
Mm.
And so I there have been a few times when over the years, my mom and I are very close. She's now 88. She's a amazing lady. But over the years, a few times there's been an occasion when she would say something and I wouldn't know. And it was probably coming out of my own insecurity about something,
Mm.
but I wouldn't quite know why she said it. And I would tell myself, you know what, just ask her why she said it.
Mm.
Don't sit there and think about it. Don't
Yeah.
ruminate on all the reasons she might have said that. Who cares? Just ask her.
Yes.
And then she would tell me. And I think
Yeah.
if you can have that kind of give and take, then even if one of you says something that's annoying, you can about it.
I love that. Because I think in that space, when we don't know, 99% of the time, we're only going to think about the worst reasons why they would say that, right? It'll just make us more insecure, more fearful. Like it's never this. I don't know anybody that naturally just assumes, oh, they just said that because they love me so much. Like So, but most of the time it's from a much more positive place than it is from a negative place. So I love that tool to just, when you're feeling that way, just ask instead of already knowing. Like, it doesn't make any sense to already decide this is what they're doing. I know why they're doing it. And how to just start having that conversation with our parents.
Yeah.
I like
Now,
that. That's a good tool.
that leads me to another schema that I wanted to
Okay.
mention called entitlement. The
Mm,
entitlement schema is closely associated with the with basically with narcissism. And we hear a lot nowadays
mm,
about narcissism, narcissistic behavior. There is such a
yeah.
thing as narcissistic personality disorder. There's also just good old narcissistic behavior. Not everyone who acts narcissistic from time to time, which might be most of us, um,
Mm,
is a narcissist. But
okay.
but one can definitely have narcissistic behavior. And I also think, because again, we all have our own biases, I think sometimes as a parent, we parent narcissistically in that we assume our kid is going to be just like us. And
Mm,
so we're kind of expecting things from them that are what we would do or what we would think. And so
yeah.
I always try to tell people, okay, put aside your narcissistic parenting hat. And
Yes.
and then you've got to think about what your kid is like, not what you are like, that sort of thing.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
I digress. But anyway, about entitlement. So entitlement schema basically says that comes at life through the lens of rules don't apply to me, and it's kind of related to I'm the victim here,
Mm,
and it's not my fault, that sort of thing. And so
yeah.
if a parent has that schema, it is hard to have a great relationship with them
Mm,
because it's hard for them to have self-awareness. If you're always
mm,
blaming someone else, it's hard to, have self-awareness.
yeah.
So you might have to lower your expectations. An adult child whose older parents have one or more has the entitlement, schema, would probably have to adjust their expectations for how close they were going to
Yeah.
be able to be. And they, at times they might have to laugh and roll their eyes and say, "Oh well, that's just my parent."
Yeah. Yeah. How much do you feel like, in that, I wonder, maybe let's go back to the enmeshment, because I'm wondering how much all of these sort of like get triggered with it. Because even in each of them, where I'm thinking is, I'm like, okay, how do we, at the root of all of these things, it again is like separating out and owning who am I going to be responsible for your decisions, let your yes be yes and your no be no, not out of, trying to destroy this relationship, but also like, how do we please each other? We want to accept each other. It's okay to have some expectations of each other and have healthy boundaries. So maybe, because especially even in the entitlement space, I just keep thinking like, man, all of these keep bumping up into how do I accept who I am and who I'm not, and accept who my parents are and who they aren't. So yeah, let's go back to maybe talk a little bit more, give some examples about the enmeshment and what we can do with that, if that's the scheme, or how does that look, or does it kind of intertwine with all of these things?
Well, okay, so if let's you want to talk about enmeshment first, right? And then entitlement.
Yes.
So
Yes.
with the enmeshment schema, um, okay, I know a mom whose daughter moved to take her, you know, master's degree or something, and went to a different country.
Okay.
And the mom texted with the daughter multiple times a day. And it the daughter, already had her bachelor's degree. This was her master's, so she was in her 20s. And she found it frustrating. It was like she
Mm,
couldn't breathe almost. Now, it's not like she didn't love her mom. It's not like she wasn't grateful for her mom, but it was over, it just became too much.
Yeah.
So that's how you feel when you're on the receiving end of enmeshment,
Mm.
when you're older. So again, going back to coping styles, if you have the surrendered coping style, you'll just give in and you'll
Mm.
end up being enmeshed with your mom. And, you might get married, but then you can't make any decision unless you've called mom and talked to her first. And
Yeah.
your husband might be like, wow, I, I feel like you talked to your mom more than you talked to me. So I'm just saying that's what it could
Yeah.
look like. Or you could have the avoidance schema and just avoid all the difficult conversations with your mom and try to give in as much as possible and not rock the boat.
Mm.
And if you have the coping style, and then if you have the counterattacking coping style, you might just say, well, you're driving me nuts and I'm not going to talk to you until you
Mm.
change. So lay
Mm.
down the law. So I'm just saying
Yeah.
that's how that might play out.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are really helpful. I love being able to break those down to like, how does this show up? How do we actually use this information? And
Mhm.
so as a side note, then you're talking about these coping styles.
Mhm.
Is there just generally three? Like, is that a schema three, or where did those three come from? What was the
I think
school of thought?
in schema therapy they talk about those three coping styles. Um,
Yeah.
I'm sure in other therapies, I've heard it compared to that started out as fight or flight, that you're
Yeah.
usually a person who either fights or runs away. And then
Yes.
somebody else up with fright. And then someone else came up with the fourth one, which is fall.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not I can't say I've ever been trained to understand all that exactly. But
Yes.
there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of
Yes. Yeah. But it's helpful, I think, even for us to even like, how do we start making sense of all of these things? And so I like being able to have those, just some context, some language to start using around it.
I think it
And
helps.
it does. It helps to really, even just to not make any of them right or wrong. Like
Mhm.
one is not better than the other. They just are, right? Like
That's right.
this just is our foundation and the framework in which we see the world. And how
Yes.
do we get curious then? Like, oh, how does mom see the world? Oh,
Mhm.
how does my husband see the world? And they're not my way's right, your way's wrong. But it's really easy to go there. I think because then that makes us feel better, right? Like then my way has to be right and your way has to be wrong. Otherwise, I'm wrong, and that doesn't sound good. But instead, how do we just keep owning, like, take that language out of it entirely? To they're not right or wrong. There's not a better or worse. It just is. How do we want to function within it? Is that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I do think that part of, growing up is understanding that there's a lot more gray than there is black and white.
Hmm.
And, if we're wise, I mean, someone once said, when you're a child, I wish I could remember this quote. I need to go find it and write it down, but something to the effect of uh, a child, when they're young, they see their parents as a superhero.
Mm.
Um, and then when they're teens, they start to see that their parents have faults. When they become adults, they realize that their parents are normal.
Mm.
And then when they can forgive their parents, they become wise. I'm sure it was said better than that, but I'll
Yeah.
try to find that.
Ooh, I like that. I like hearing that right now because I'm in the phase right now of parenting a teenager. So
Yeah.
it's hard. So even hearing all of these coping styles, I think being able to apply, like I do also feel really grateful. I'm close to my parents and we have, I don't know if it would be accidental or just happened to, maybe our personality styles have just worked to sort of have a lot of this language for to repair a lot in my and my mom's relationship. Um Especially to be able to, like, I'm thinking 20 steps ahead. And I actually just had a really great conversation with a guy who started a company that helps be a resource for adult children that have to care for their elderly parents that need help, right? Like, so when you get to that stage of life, so even just the importance of before your parents are dependent on you for their livelihood, let's get all this emotional relationship, start working it out now so that you can physically sacrifice for their needs, financially, emotionally, time, all of those things. It's just going to get harder later.
Absolutely.
But anyway, but thinking about how it feels for me now, having a teen, right? I'm just trying to become more self-aware as a parent. And I think one of the things you were describing, and it might be in the between the entitlement and the enmeshment of like, oh, you are your own person, and how do we not take it personally when you don't like the things that I like? You don't want to take on the things and the way that I value, the way that I see the world. How do we allow that to grow without it being a personal attack? Like, then you don't love me anymore, right? Like, if it's not the same, then it must be hatred or a rejection, right? So maybe speak to us in that when for the adult child who has they've only interpreted these frustrations as rejection, what else could be possible?
I love that. Yeah. So rather than interpret it as rejection, and obviously now we're talking to the older parents about their adult children,
Yeah.
is celebrate the differences.
Mm,
So, part of the success of a leader is to raise up other leaders who can even surpass them, or at least
mm,
take over from their role and walk in their shoes,
yeah.
and hopefully even surpass them. That's success as a leader.
Mm,
Success as a parent is the same thing. So if you
mm,
actually do your job as a parent, what do we have with iPhone? I don't know. Is iPhone on number 16 or 15 now? I forget what model they're
yeah.
on. But
Yeah.
it started out just the iPhone. Then it came out iPhone 2. Then there was iPhone X. I don't know. I'm not trying to
Yeah.
advertise for them. I'm just saying there's that concept of the new and upgraded version. And in a way, if we do
Yes.
our job well as a parent, our kids should be the new upgraded version of us. These should have,
Mm,
hopefully, our strengths and gifts, but then they'll have their own.
yeah.
So I look at my two children, and I really think that they've got some of my strengths, they've got some of John's strengths, and then they have some of their own that are completely them and not me at all.
Yeah.
And I love that. And so I try to celebrate the difference and
Yeah.
think about the ways I respect my daughter and how you're so much better at that than I ever was. Wow, I respect you so much for that.
Mm,
Um, and same with my son.
yeah.
Does that
That's
answer the question?
it does. Well, that's a beautiful description because I think it speaks to, I think, just as humans, right? Even just women in general. There's so much competition and we compare. So even if we're just talking about like peer to peer, right? And now we look at
Mhm.
social media and it's so easy to look at other people doing well or they have it all together or you like something that they're doing that you don't. And it's so easy for us to naturally just interpret that as a threat, as we reject ourselves, right? Like it's just pointing out all of our weaknesses and our flaws instead of being able to come alongside them to celebrate them. Like, how much more would we want that for our own children and our family? Like, why would we look at our kids doing well as an exposure of our weakness, right? And instead be able to flip that script and think of it as like, wow, like what a great, like, that's my goal is to help you and to become you, not a better version of like, I didn't make the soccer team. So now you must become a professional soccer player, right? Like, that's different, right? Like it's
Yeah. Yeah.
not be a better version of all the things I wanted to do and couldn't do, fulfill my dreams,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
yeah, like how do you get to be your own person and to be success? What does success look like? I think that's a beautiful visual that is so much more connecting as opposed to threatening to us. I love that. So, I guess what would be maybe some of your thoughts or advice or um, a purpose, I guess. Like, how can we, so me being, we'll talk to all the adult parents, the value or the necessity to kind of clean up your relationship with your older parents. How does that impact your ability to parent your children?
Excellent question. So, partly, I think in order to repair your relationship even a little bit with your older parent, you have to work on yourself. You have to
Mm,
grow in your own self awareness. It's not going to work if you just go in there gangbusters, hey, our relationship stinks and it's your fault. That's not going to work.
yeah. Yeah.
So, I'm
Even
sure
if we
many
feel
people,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
people may have tried that, but it doesn't work. So you have to work on yourself. You have to get more self awareness. You yourself grow in your own mental wellness, in your own resilience,
Yeah.
in your own, you know, acceptance of yourself,
Yeah.
in less judging of yourself. And as you
Hmm.
do that, that helps you then to extend that to other people, including your older parent.
Yeah.
And while you're working on that, it will also, I think, remind you a byproduct of that, of working on your relationship with your older parent. A byproduct of that is that you're going to remember the things that your parents did when you were growing up that exasperated you.
Mm.
And that's actually something we talk about a lot in our Good Enough Parenting program, because we found that in the Bible, actually in the New Testament, there is only one command in the whole New Testament that specifically tells parents how to parent.
Mm.
Obviously, there are many, passages that can apply to parenting, but there's only one
Yeah.
command. It appears in Ephesians and in Colossians, but it's the same command. And in Ephesians 6:4, it specifically, the Bible says, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children, but bring them up or nurture them in the training and discipline of the Lord."
Mm.
And that right there, even though it's just one verse, if
Yeah.
people really understand what it means to exasperate and to nurture, that can change your whole
Mm.
parenting.
Yeah.
Um, my husband did his PhD on that exact thing, measuring. He made up a questionnaire that was given to over a thousand individuals in various countries around the world, measuring things that made them feel exasperated by their parents, and then turning it
Yeah.
into a scale that now you can give to, say, a 15-year-old, and they can rate their parent on levels of exasperation in different areas. Or you, as a
Yeah.
40-year-old, can take that questionnaire and figure out, how did your parents exasperate you? But the reason I'm
Mm.
saying that is, as you figure that out, it might make you have an aha moment then while you're parenting your children, and you're like, oops, I'm
Mm.
exasperating them in the exact same way that my parent exasperated me.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Now, you might not be doing that, which is wonderful, but there could be some definite overlap.
For sure. Yeah. Let's go back and maybe define for people if they've never heard that concept of exasperating, or we've heard it but haven't really yeah, we think we kind of know what it means, but what are we talking about? What is exasperating? What would be maybe you can give us some examples of what that looks like.
Sure. So, when we did the research, what came out in the research, for instance, there were 10 things, 10 items that came out in the research that universally, whether you're asking people in Africa or India or Indonesia or Europe or America, so pretty much came out the same everywhere around the world.
Wow.
Um, One of them is called, I'm trying to think of specific ones that would be helpful. One of them is just called over controlling.
Mm.
So when kids have an interaction with a parent where they feel over controlled. Of course, all parents bringing up little children have to help teach them control, and there is controlling in that, but over control. So when
Okay.
a parent is over controlling, that makes the child feel exasperation. And if a parent does that, now and again, it's not going to be a big deal because all parents make mistakes. But if that's a
Yeah.
lifestyle in the family, that will really exasperate the child and cause harm.
Yeah. What's the
That's one
difference?
example.
What would be the difference? Because I'm thinking it could get confusing for a parent who's like something even just for myself, right? Like, so you have toddler stage, you have, um, preteen, then you've got teens. And there's got to be like, we're selfish and we want to do it our way when we want to do it as a kid, right? And so our parents coming in, like, it can all feel like, I said, like, how is it not all exasperating just because you have expectations of me? What does over controlling look like versus controlling, like, as a child? What makes it actually exasperating versus irritating?
Great question. Often in schema therapy, they will talk about the frustration of core emotional needs not being met. So there's a
Okay.
difference in that kind of frustration and in your child feeling frustrated. Because, when your kid's learning how to tie their shoes, they get frustrated, but you're
Yeah.
not frustrating them. Now, if you stand there and scream at them and embarrass them for not learning how to tie their shoe, that's different.
Mm.
But, children get frustrated when they don't get their way sometimes. They get frustrated when
Yeah.
you won't let them have candy for dinner. That kind of frustration is not what we're talking about.
Yes. Whew.
And so as a teen, it's the same, right? There's a lot of things that
Yeah.
frustrate a teen because a teen's job is actually to become their own person.
Mm.
But to do that, it's just like the terrible twos. Becoming a
Yeah.
teenager, going through puberty and becoming an adult, a young adult, is kind of like another version of toddlerhood. So it's hard. A toddler is learning that they're not the same person as their mom and they're separating.
Mm.
But then, they run away and scream, but then they want you to hold them. And
Yeah.
so a teen is very similar. So I
Mm.
once read a book about helping mothers of preteen girls called Don't Stop Loving Me.
Mm.
And, you know, teenage girls, especially between 10 and 15 years old, have been known to say, I hate you to their parents. But then they also really want, you know, the parent
Yeah.
to love them and accept them unconditionally.
Yeah.
So getting
Yeah.
back to your question, you have to decide, am I frustrating their meeting their core emotional need right now? Or
Mm.
are they frustrated because I won't let them go to the fifth movie this week or something, or this month, because
Yeah.
we don't have enough. That's too much money or whatever. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yes, that does. Yeah. And it
Yeah. And
might
there
be
is,
something we have to just get curious about and figure out as we go. And really,
that's
there's
right.
an underlying distinction, not just on the surface. Just because you're unhappy doesn't mean, like, the goal is not to just make everybody
For them,
happy.
for them to be perpetually happy. Well, and I seriously, one of the core needs is called reasonable limits. So you have to be giving them limits, or
Mm.
else you're actually not loving them the way you should. And a lot of parents
Yeah.
don't get that. I remember,
Yeah.
of course, first and foremost, we always say the first core emotional need is connection and acceptance. So
Mm.
you've got to meet that need, and that takes a lot of intentionality and
Yeah.
learning to not exasperate. But
Yeah.
I remember when my kids were probably 5 and 3, and there was someone that we knew in the kids' preschool. I was friends with the mom that I would, how you see moms when you're picking the kids up. We were that level of friends, basically
Yeah.
acquainted. But I thought, oh, I'll go, hang out with her. I made a play date. She had 2 kids. I had 2 kids. Brought my kids over to her house, and she and I were having tea. And honestly, her kids were such terrors that my kids were like, kept running into the kitchen going, like basically trying to stay safe.
Oh no.
And, and so, you know, as we were talking, it was obvious. It was so obvious that my kids were afraid of her kids. And she was feeling a little
Oh.
bit embarrassed. And then she commented on how, awesome my kids were, which they were not perfect children, but I guess compared to hers, it was obvious.
Yeah.
And so she was like, "Oh, your kids are amazing," and this and that. And I was like, what do you say? But then she said, well, let's see, how did she say it? She said, well, I just have this philosophy. I always had this philosophy that if you give them everything they want all the time, that they'll just be so grateful that they'll obey.
Oh.
And I said, oh, well, I suppose that's rather different than my philosophy. And then I thought she would say, well, tell me your philosophy. And instead she said, well, I guess everyone is just different. And I'm like, I guess they are. And
Yeah.
then when we got in the car to leave, I said, kids, I'm so sorry. I'll never make you go there again. Because they were like, Mom, you can't leave us with those kids ever again.
Oh my goodness. It was a disaster. Oh my goodness. Okay, so that makes me think about so earlier we were talking about different the negative schemas. Are there any negative schemas about the exasperation? Or like kind of where's the harm really kind of show
How
up for
does all
that?
that work? Okay. So
Yeah.
here's an example. So there's 10 exasperation interactions that we found in research,
Okay.
7 nurturing interactions, but 10
Okay.
exasperation interactions. But one of them is called emotional deprivation and emotional inhibition. That means if you
Okay.
have an interaction with your child during which they either feel emotionally deprived or emotionally inhibited, meaning their emotions are shut down, that will cause them to feel exasperated. That's what that means. And
Okay.
so for, as a personal example, I grew up in a family, again, my parents are lovely, wonderful people, and I had tons of nurturance, super, fortunate, and I thank God for it literally all the time. Um, but I would say also my parents were, especially my dad, they were not comfortable with what people, the so-called more negative emotions. And I don't really
Mm.
think there are negative emotions. I think all of our emotions are God given. But some people think that things like anger or fear or sadness, etc.,
Mm.
are, negative emotions. And so
Yeah.
my I would say my dad especially, but even my mom to an extent, they just weren't comfortable discussing it or dealing with those.
Mm.
So then I grew up not really being in touch with my emotions, therefore.
Mm.
And then even when I, became a Christian, one of the verses in the Bible in the New Testament in Luke 9 says that we're supposed to, deny ourselves. So I took that to mean, even
Mm.
including denying your emotions. So I'm like, I don't
Mm.
have negative emotions. I deny them. And so
Oh.
that's how I operated, maybe for the first 8 or 9 years of my Christian life.
Mm.
So it was kind of like their exasperation towards me. I didn't rebel against it. I almost embraced it. and
Yeah.
and so then what happened was it that kept me from being able to be in touch with myself, for one thing.
Mm.
Luckily I married someone who's like so in touch with their emotions, they always know how they feel. So that helped. Um,
Yeah.
but also then when I had kids, and when, for instance, Sonia was sad about something, my go-to sort of phrase would be, well, sweetie, you don't need to be sad. We have so
Mm.
much to be happy about. And
Mm.
I was basically like, if you've ever seen the original Inside Out movie, I was basically like Joy. I wanted
Yes.
everyone to feel joy all the time.
Yeah.
And I had to learn that sadness and fear and anger are actually good sometimes.
Yes. They
That
have their
movie,
place.
that I felt like that movie was made about me actually. But
Did you see
I
Inside Out too, by the way?
no, and it is here I'm in Malaysia right now, and it is here, so I'm definitely going to go. I'm
Yeah,
so
you're gonna
excited.
love it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
it's very
I'm
good.
gonna love
Very
it.
good.
I know.
Yeah.
But one of the
Okay,
things
back
that
to your yeah.
yeah, yeah. So one of the books I read when my daughter was 8 years old was called How to Talk So Your Kids Will Listen and
Mm.
Listen So Your Kids Will Talk.
Mm.
That book is written by Adele Faber and Elaine Maslish, and it's definitely available on Amazon. It's probably one of
Okay.
their best-selling parenting books of all time. But that book explains in very helpful detail how to facilitate your children understanding their emotions and how to do the opposite,
Mm.
not shut them down, but let them
Yeah.
be validated. So
Mm.
we worked that into our program. We even wrote to them and got copyright permission from them
Mm.
to work part of that into our program because we feel like what they say about validating emotions is so helpful. And that helped me to change.
Mm.
So, for example, let's say I'm making this up. This didn't happen, but it's things like this probably did happen, but not this exact story. But let's say
Yeah.
one of my kids comes home and is like, "Oh, I wish I wanted to punch that Michael in the nose today in the
Mm.
playground." Now, my old pattern would have been to say, "Well, sweetie, we shouldn't fight with people, or we shouldn't punch people, or even, Jesus doesn't want us to punch people." I could totally see
Yeah,
myself saying that.
for
However,
sure.
I learned that's going to, shut them down. Don't do that. So instead, I learned to say, "Oh, wow, it sounds like you're really angry."
Mm.
Yes. See, then that allows them to say yes.
Mm.
And if they want to, they'll talk more. And if they don't, you might have to ask them some more questions. But basically, you want to find out, well, what did Michael do?
Yeah.
Now, what if they say, "Oh, he was going around the playground pulling down the girls' panties," or something
Yeah.
like that, right? Then you're like so proud of your kid for wanting to punch Michael in the nose. And you're like,
Yeah.
wow, I don't blame you. I might have wanted to punch him in the nose too. Goodness me. Well,
Yeah.
what do you think you should do about that? Or what did you do? You can ask,
Mm.
"Oh, you didn't punch him in the nose. Wow, that's self control. What did you do?" And then you let
Yeah.
them tell you more. And so you're just having this amazing conversation with your kid, and you're getting in touch with what kind of things make your kid feel indignant.
Yeah.
And then you can even have a plan together. "Well, do you think we might should do something about it tomorrow? Would you like my help? I mean, I can help you. We could talk to your teacher or whatever." But you
Yeah.
can let them come up with some ideas. Now, what if on a completely different note, what if they say, "Well, Michael always gets A's and I always get C's."
Mm.
So then there's another issue that your kid is feeling bad about themselves.
Yeah.
So then you might say something like, um, you know, you would probably want to go in the direction of, "Oh, I didn't know that you were feeling bad about, your math class." And then
Mm.
you just go off in a whole different issue rather than saying, "I can't believe you want to punch Michael for that. What on
Yeah.
earth?"
Yeah.
Which completely shuts them down and you don't find out about how they're feeling anyway.
Yeah.
Now, later, even in a different conversation, you could say, "So is that Michael's fault that he makes an A? I mean, is that really something
Mm.
you want to punch him for?" But you can
Yeah.
get to that later because that's not really
Yes.
what they're going to do anyway. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It does. It's like not overreacting just on the logistics or our own
Mm.
assumption about what was happening. But yeah, being able to have the conversation, like, how did you even get to that point? What else, what led you to this feeling? Let's talk about this beforehand and give voice to it. Just acknowledging what's happening. Those are really good. I like that. Well, okay, so we've covered a lot of really great ground, I think. Thank you so much for your time and getting to all of these
Thank you.
thoughts. I think we definitely, the way you started it was like the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. So I'm, without leaving our guests then feeling all overwhelmed that are listening, what would be maybe just some practical suggestions, some tips, some tools that we could get into for even the parent or the person who feels like they're just hearing this information for the very first time. There's like just this, I don't even know where to go. And then maybe some that have attempted and it hasn't gone very well. You know, like wherever you're an expert or this is brand new information to you, what could we do to just kind of some tools to put in our tool belt and some baby steps to take?
Awesome. And it's always good to have some first steps, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I think for, someone like me who was not as in touch with my emotions, one thing that definitely helped me was journaling
Mm.
and just allowing myself time to literally just write. Now, some people might like to journal by typing, but I almost think there's something like physiological that happens when you write, but
Yeah.
by hand in a book. But whatever helps you. But I would
Yeah.
say I'm not great at necessarily knowing how I feel in the beginning, but if I write and read and get aha moments and whatnot over time, then I can eventually boil it down. So I remember
Mm.
once having written several books full of journal times about a certain topic that was bothering me. But
Yeah.
then by the end of the day, I could boil it down to one page. So
Mm.
journaling, I think, is really helpful, no matter what we're talking about. But certainly, if you're trying to repair your relationship with your older parents, that would be
Yeah.
something. Like I said earlier, writing letters, because sometimes
Mm.
if you try to talk with someone especially someone who's like pretty strong
Yeah.
in their opinions, they're going to disagree with you from the get go, and you think, what's the point? So if you write a letter, they might not like the
Yeah.
content, but they have the chance to go back and read it over and over again.
Yeah.
And so that might help. Um, Another thing would be I hesitated because I'm not trying to be self-serving here. Um, but if you might want to read the Good Enough Parenting book, that might
Yeah.
help.
Yes.
Um, because it will explain a lot of these concepts more, So
Yeah.
I wrote down here, give them a book, not necessarily Good Enough Parenting, but give them a book and ask them to read and discuss. So if you think your
Mm.
parent is open to discussing a book with you, I think that's,
That's a good idea.
yeah. And I think that works in many relationships, but that can definitely work with your older parents.
Yeah.
Also, I wrote down here, practice forgiveness, but also know that forgiveness does not necessarily equal trust and or reconciliation. So
Mm.
just because you've forgiven someone doesn't mean you have to then violate all your boundaries again. So I'll
Yeah.
leave it at that rather than get launched on that paragraph.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Also, I put practice gratitude, but not toxic positivity.
Mm.
So, and then last but not least, we already touched on this a little bit when you were sharing about, what was our mom going through when they were 40 or whatever.
Yeah.
But I just thought, understanding their story is so useful as a starting place. One lady
Yeah.
I know, when she studied overseas. She was from Southeast Asia, and then she studied in Europe for her university. While she was there, she decided to forgive her dad for some of the physical abuse that he had, literally taken out on her. Um,
Yeah.
but then when she moved back to work in her home country, she had to see her dad a lot, and she found that the forgiveness was a little bit harder when he was, right there with
Mm,
her. And then one day it dawned on her, why don't I ask my dad about his childhood? Because he
mm,
never talked about his childhood ever.
yeah.
And then what she found out almost, shocked her to the core. But she found out that he had left China and come to Southeast Asia as a teenager, and he was an indentured servant, meaning basically he was a
Mm,
slave, quote unquote, until his wages, which were very minute,
yeah.
could until his wages could pay off what he owed. Kind of like what we would associate with human trafficking nowadays.
Mm,
And he was tortured and abused in every kind of way possible. And then
wow.
when she found that out, she was like, oh, it almost made her feel like, wow, I think I got off easy. Not really, but
Yeah.
it made her feel a lot more grace
Yeah,
towards her dad. So I'm
for
not
sure.
saying you should put up with their repeated behavior, and certainly she would never, put up with him if he was physically abusive again, which he was not. But I
Yes.
just think learning to understand their story is helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think in that example, right? Like you can have so much more
Mm,
separation that clearly whatever her dad was not doing had nothing to do with like her value and her as a human being. Like
right.
he was doing 10 times better to her than what he had experienced, right?
Mm,
Like you can, you know, it wasn't great, but he gave his very best, right? And how do we just I read this in a book somewhere and they were talking about like just our capacity to love, our capacity to have time for people or to serve people. Like we want 100% from people that in their reality, like if they only had 20% to give you, if they gave you that 20%, like they gave you 100% of what they had to give. Yeah. And you're
Not
like, man, like, yeah, like separating out that, like, it's not our, and we're just so quick to make it mean something about us and our value. And if I was worthy, you would never hurt me. And it's like just such an unrealistic expectation and is not true, right? Like, and that is just a bold faced lie to make those two correlations. And so I think that's a lot of even just hearing in this conversation that we're having today is just the ability and what is available for us to separate out our value and our personal worth, our parents' worth and their value, our children, our teens, especially, right? Like we are impacting each other, but there is still so much very unique and valuable within us. But also, then there's so much room for us to own and to grow, to not cause intended harm or to just blatant harm each other.
mm,
Where's that room to separate out between we're just doing our best and loving each other and seeing the good? Like it's not all bad. But being able to just give voice to that, get curious about yourself, get curious about your parents, get curious about your kids, and how do we make it a win-win in our unique ways? So it's a journey. And I would say I would add in my own 2 cents of a tool, I think, of just they are baby steps. It's new. It's new to you. It's if you've never done it before, it's especially going to be new to your parents. So tread graciously and take your time. It didn't, we didn't get this way overnight. It's been a lifetime.
mm,
And so let it be a journey of, you know, continual growth and continual maturing. So we can't expect perfection and we certainly can't expect it overnight. So, well, Karen, thank you so much for your time. That was really great nuggets and information. And I'll put those book recommendations in the show notes as well if you guys want to go get them for yourself. And let us know. Send me an email. Find me on Instagram if you have more questions or want to get curious or just yeah, me too. Like I can totally relate to that. I am here for you. I love to do one-on-one coaching. If you want to go through more extensive understanding and someone to come alongside of you And I know that Karen does her coaching as well. She has a great book. I have that book, Good Enough Parenting. I want to go back and reread it again. So thank you so much for your time, your expertise, your knowledge, your experience, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this. I think you're helping so many people, and I'm very excited about it.
Oh, thank you so much, Karen. I appreciate it. All right, everyone. Until next time. Bye.